Welcome to Untold Whispers. I'm your narrator tonight, here to share a story both haunting and peaceful. Take a deep breath, dim the lights, let the night settle in. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more quiet chills. Tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know who's still awake with me tonight. I travel to Portland about 4 times a year for work, and I've stayed in probably 20 different Airbnbs around the city. I thought I knew what to look for by that point. Good reviews, responsive hosts, clear photos. This particular booking seemed perfect. It was a craftsman-style house in the Hawthorne district, walking distance to the office where I had meetings all week. The host had hundreds of 5-star reviews, and the listing explicitly said, "Entire place to yourself." That last part mattered to me because I'd be working late, taking early calls with the East Coast, and I just wanted privacy. The price was reasonable for a whole house, maybe even a little cheap, but I figured it was an older place, and Portland's market had cooled down a bit. When I arrived on a Sunday afternoon, the house was actually charming. Classic Portland craftsman with built-in shelving, original hardwood floors, and that cozy, slightly cramped feeling these old houses have. The host had left a welcome basket with local coffee and a handwritten note. I did a quick walkthrough, and everything matched the photos. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs, a bathroom, a kitchen, and living room on the main floor, and I noticed a door next to the kitchen that had a padlock on it. I assumed it led to the basement and figured that's where the host kept their storage or personal belongings. That's pretty normal when someone rents out their place. I didn't think anything of it. The first night was completely fine. I worked late, ordered Thai food, and fell asleep watching Netflix around 11. The second night is when things got weird. I woke up suddenly at 2 in the morning, and I'm usually a deep sleeper, so something must have disturbed me. I lay there in the dark, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps directly below my bedroom. Not like creaking pipes or the house settling. Actual footsteps, walking from one end of the space below me to the other, then stopping. My bedroom was at the front of the house on the 2nd floor, and the room below me would have been that locked basement area. I turned on my bedside lamp and just sat there listening. My heart was pounding. The footsteps started again, a little faster this time, and then I heard what sounded like a door closing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was sounds carrying from outside, or maybe the neighbors. But it was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, and the houses in that neighborhood are pretty well built. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, or that there was some logical explanation. I had a full day of meetings, and by evening I'd mostly pushed it out of my mind. But that night, around 1 in the morning, I was still up working on my laptop in bed when I heard it again. Footsteps. Then, unmistakably, a man's cough, deep and phlegmy. Then I heard water running through the pipes in the walls. Someone was taking a shower in the basement. I completely panicked. I grabbed my phone and called the host immediately. It went to voicemail. I texted, "There is someone in the basement. I can hear them. What is going on?" No response. I texted again. "I'm calling the police if you don't respond." Still nothing. I genuinely considered calling 911, but what would I say? I hear someone in a part of the house I don't have access to. I didn't sleep at all that night. I pushed my dresser against the bedroom door and just waited for morning. Around 7 in the morning, I heard footsteps on the main floor. Heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots. I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down, and there was a man in the kitchen. He was maybe in his mid-40s, wearing jeans and a stained t-shirt, making coffee with the French press like he owned the place. When he saw me, he didn't even look surprised. He just nodded and said, "Morning." I asked him who he was and what he was doing in the house. He said, "I'm staying in the basement. Don't worry about it. Mike knows I'm here." Mike was the host's name. The man said it so casually, like this was a completely normal arrangement. I told him the listing said entire place, and no one told me anyone else would be here. He just shrugged and said, Mike lets him stay there sometimes, when he needs a place, and that I had the upstairs. So what was the problem? I went back to my room, locked the door, and immediately called Airbnb. Then I called the host again and again until he finally picked up. When I told him there was a man living in his basement, he got defensive. He said his friend was going through a hard time and only needed to crash there for a few days, and it shouldn't affect me at all because the basement is completely separate. I told him that wasn't what I paid for and that he'd lied in the listing. He actually got angry with me. He said I was being unreasonable and that if I left early, he'd give me a bad review for not being flexible and understanding. I packed my stuff in about 10 minutes while the man was still downstairs. I could hear him watching TV in the living room. I hauled my suitcase down the stairs and he didn't even look at me when I left. I went straight to a hotel and filed a police report, mainly to have documentation of the whole thing. Airbnb eventually refunded me after I sent them the police report number, but the host left me a scathing review calling me dramatic. The whole thing still creeps me out. Who was that man? How long had this been going on? And how many other guests had Mike done this to? We got married in March, and by the time we could actually take our honeymoon, it was late May. We'd been planning this trip to Tulum for months, one of those boutique villa rentals right on the beach, private pool, the whole romantic package. My husband Jake works in IT security, and I'm a graphic designer, so we were both desperate to unplug and just enjoy being newlyweds. The villa looked incredible in the photos. Modern Mexican architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows, and this gorgeous outdoor shower surrounded by tropical plants. It was expensive, but we figured you only honeymoon once. When we arrived, the place was somehow even more beautiful in person. The host wasn't there, but he'd arranged for a property manager to meet us and hand over the keys. She showed us around quickly, pointed out where everything was, and left us alone. We spent the first day just decompressing, swimming in the pool, drinking margaritas, watching the sunset from the deck. It was perfect. That night, we ordered ceviche from a local place and ate dinner outside under the stars. Everything felt magical. The next morning, Jake woke up before me and was drinking coffee on the terrace when I found him staring at his phone with this weird expression. I asked what was wrong, and he said probably nothing. But then he did that thing he does when he's working through a problem. He got really quiet and focused. We'd been joking the day before about hidden cameras because Jake had just finished working on a security audit for a hotel chain, and one of the things they discussed was the rising number of Airbnb camera incidents. He'd said half-jokingly that he should scan the network here, and I'd laughed it off. But now he was actually doing it. He'd downloaded this network scanning app onto his phone and was checking what devices were connected to the villa's Wi-Fi. I thought he was being paranoid, and honestly, I was a little annoyed that he was working on our honeymoon. But then his face changed. He said there was a device on the network that didn't make sense. It wasn't the smart TV, wasn't the thermostat, wasn't the router. It was something else, and it was actively transmitting data. I started to feel uneasy. Jake got his laptop and did a more detailed scan, and he was able to trace the signal to somewhere in the bedroom. We went inside and he pulled up an app that could detect camera lenses using the phone's flashlight. He slowly moved around the room, pointing his phone at different things. The air vents, the TV, the mirrors. When he pointed it up at the smoke detector on the ceiling above the bed, we both saw it at the same time. A tiny glint of light reflecting back, like a little pinprick of glass catching the flashlight beam. My stomach dropped. Jake dragged a chair over and carefully unscrewed the smoke detector cover. It was a real smoke detector, but it had been modified. There was a small camera lens embedded in it, pointing directly down at the bed, and it was connected to a micro SD card. The camera was still warm. It was actively recording. I felt physically sick. We'd been here for a full day and night. We'd changed clothes, showered, slept, everything, all in view of this camera. Jake's hands were shaking as he carefully removed the SD card and the camera module. He plugged the SD card into his laptop, and what we found made everything so much worse. There were hundreds of video files, months worth. The timestamps went back to January. We fast-forwarded through some of them, and it was other couples, other honeymoons, other vacations, people who had no idea they were being filmed in their most private moments. We immediately called the local police. I was crying, Jake was furious, and we were both trying to figure out what to do. The Mexican police actually took it seriously, which I'd been worried about. 2 officers came to the villa within an hour. Jake showed them everything: the camera, the SD card, the network log showing it was streaming footage somewhere. They told us to pack our things and that they'd be coordinating with the tourism police because this was a serious crime. While we were packing, Jake decided to do one more sweep of the entire property. He found 2 more cameras. One was in the bathroom, hidden in what looked like a phone charger plugged into the wall outlet near the mirror. The other was in the outdoor shower, tucked into a gap in the decorative stonework. 3 cameras total, all positioned to capture the most intimate moments. The host was arrested that afternoon. The police told us he owned several properties in Tulum and that they'd be investigating all of them. Apparently, there had been one other complaint about him a year ago, but the guests hadn't been able to prove anything. The footage we found was evidence of him filming dozens of couples without consent. We later found out through a victim advocacy group that he'd been selling some of the videos online. Airbnb removed all his listings immediately and refunded us, but the company's response felt inadequate given what had happened. They offered us some travel credits which felt almost insulting. We ended up spending the rest of our honeymoon at a large resort chain, where at least there were security protocols and regulations. The worst part wasn't even the violation itself, though. That was horrible. It was the paranoia afterward. We came home, and I found myself checking every smoke detector, every air freshener, every USB charger in our own house. Jake did a full security sweep of our apartment. We can't stay in Airbnbs anymore without tearing them apart looking for cameras first. What should have been the most romantic week of our lives turned into this traumatic thing that we can't stop thinking about. The case is still ongoing in Mexico. We gave statements and handed over all the evidence, but we have no idea if we'll ever have to testify or what will actually happen to him. Sometimes I look at our honeymoon photos from that first perfect day, before we knew, and I can barely recognize how happy we looked. Now, every time I see a smoke detector, my heart starts racing. I was doing a solo trip through Central Europe last September, and Prague was my 3rd stop. I'd booked this studio apartment in the Vinohrady neighborhood because it looked cute and modern in the photos, and the price was reasonable for being so central. The host had decent reviews, nothing spectacular, but everything seemed fine. I was only planning to stay for 5 nights before moving on to Vienna, so I wasn't too concerned about it being perfect. I just needed a clean, safe place to sleep and store my stuff while I explored the city. When I arrived at the building, the host wasn't there. He'd sent me a code for the lockbox and said to let myself in, which was fine. I'd done that at other places. But when I opened the door to the studio, I was immediately confused. There was stuff everywhere. Women's clothing draped over the chair, makeup and toiletries covering the bathroom counter, shoes by the door, a hairbrush with long dark hair still in it sitting on the nightstand. It looked like someone was actively living there. I texted the host right away with photos, asking what was going on. He responded pretty quickly and said, "Oh, sorry. Previous guest forgot some items. Just move to the side. She'll pick up soon." The way he phrased it was odd, but I was tired from traveling and figured maybe someone had left in a hurry. It was annoying, but I pushed the clothes to one side of the closet, moved the toiletries under the sink, and tried to settle in. That first night was fine. I went out for dinner, walked around the neighborhood, came back and crashed. But the next morning, when I went to make coffee, I noticed there were groceries in the mini fridge that I definitely hadn't bought. Fresh milk, yogurt, some vegetables. I thought maybe I'd been too tired to notice them the night before, and they were just old items the previous guest left. But the milk's expiration date was 3 days away. It was fresh. I texted the host again. "There's fresh food in the fridge. Is someone else staying here?" He took hours to respond this time, and when he did, he just said, "No, just you. Maybe from before, don't worry." That response made no sense. Fresh milk from before. I started feeling uneasy, but I was in a foreign country. I'd already paid, and I didn't know what else to do. I decided to stay alert and see if anything else weird happened. Things got stranger over the next couple of days. I'd come back to the apartment after being out all day, and I'd find small things moved or changed. A towel I'd left folded on the shelf would be hanging in the bathroom damp. A coffee cup I definitely washed would be in the sink, used. One morning, I found a hair tie on the bathroom counter that hadn't been there the night before. I started taking photos of how I left things before going out, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. On the 4th day, mail was delivered and slipped under the door. It was addressed to someone named Katerina Novotna at this apartment address. I opened the building's front door to check the buzzer panel, and sure enough, there were 2 names listed for this unit, the host's name and K. Novotna. I photographed everything and texted the host demanding an explanation. He didn't respond at all this time. That evening, I went downstairs to ask the neighbor across the hall if they knew what was going on. The older woman spoke some English, and when I asked about Katerina, her face changed. She asked me, "You're renting the apartment?" When I said yes, she looked concerned and said, "But Katerina lives there. She's there in the morning sometimes. I see her." She told me Katerina was a woman in her 30s with long dark hair who'd lived in the unit for at least 6 months. I felt panic rising in my chest. I went back upstairs and started really looking around the apartment. All those belongings weren't from someone who forgot items. This was someone's entire life. Clothes for all seasons in the closet, prescription medication in the bathroom cabinet with a local pharmacy label, books in check on the shelf. Someone lived here. That night, I barely slept. I pushed the small couch against the door and kept my phone in my hand. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. A key sliding into the lock. The handle turned, and the door pushed against the couch. I heard a woman's voice say something sharp in Czech, and then the host's voice responded, also in Czech. They were arguing in the hallway. I was frozen, terrified. The woman kept trying to push the door open, and I was bracing the couch with my body, not making a sound. Finally, they left. I could hear them arguing as they went down the stairs. I didn't sleep at all the rest of the night. At 6 in the morning, the second there was daylight, I grabbed my backpack, left everything else, and got out of there. I went straight to a hostel I found on my phone and checked in immediately. Later that day, after I felt safe, I did some research. I found a Czech friend of a friend through social media who helped me understand what probably happened. The host was illegally subletting the apartment to both me as a tourist and to Katerina as a long-term tenant, probably telling her she could only be there certain hours or certain days. It's apparently a common scam in Prague. Landlords double-dipping on rent by booking their tenant's apartment on Airbnb whenever they can get away with it. Airbnb refunded me after I sent them all my documentation and photos, but it took weeks of back and forth. I still think about Katerina sometimes and wonder if she knew what was happening, or if she thought she was losing her mind, finding a stranger's belongings in her own home. The whole thing felt like a psychological thriller, and I couldn't enjoy the rest of Prague because of it. We planned our family vacation to Savannah for spring break last year. My husband and I wanted to do something different with our kids. Emma was 11 and Carter was 8, and we thought a historic southern city would be educational and fun. We're from Ohio, so the whole moss-draped trees and antebellum architecture thing felt really exotic to us. I found this beautiful Victorian house on Airbnb in the historic district, and it was perfect for what we needed. 4 bedrooms, a big front porch, walking distance to everything. The photos showed these gorgeous high ceilings, original chandeliers, and the kids were excited because they thought it looked spooky in a fun way. The host seemed nice enough in our messages. She didn't live in Savannah but inherited the property from a relative and rented it out. She gave us the access code and said to make ourselves at home. When we pulled up on that Saturday afternoon, the house was even more impressive in person. It was this massive 3-story painted lady with a turret and gingerbread trim, probably built in the 1880s. The kids were thrilled. Carter immediately said it looked haunted, and Emma rolled her eyes, but I could tell she was into it too. We spent the first day just settling in and walking around the historic squares. That night, we made dinner in the big old kitchen and the kids explored the house. These old Victorians have so much character. Creaky floors, weird little closets and nooks, servants' staircases. Emma claimed the bedroom in the turret, and Carter took the room next to ours. Everything felt like an adventure. The next morning, Carter came running into our bedroom, saying he'd found something cool. He led us to his room and showed us a loose baseboard in the closet. He'd been putting his shoes away and kicked it by accident, and it had popped out slightly. When he pulled it away from the wall, there was a gap behind it, and stuffed inside were these yellowed newspaper clippings. My husband pulled them out carefully, and when we started reading them, the whole atmosphere changed. The clippings were from 1994, from the Savannah Morning News. The headlines made my blood run cold. Murder-suicide shocks historic district. Father kills wife, self in Victorian home. There were multiple articles, and they all detailed the same horrific story. A man named Robert Chenoweth had shot his wife Michelle in their bedroom, then gone into the bathroom and shot himself. Their 2 children, who were teenagers, had been at school when it happened. The address in the articles was our address. I felt sick. My husband immediately pulled out his phone and started Googling. He found more articles, online archives, even a post on some true crime forum discussing the case. There were details about how the couple had financial problems, how neighbors had heard them fighting. One article mentioned that Michelle had been planning to leave and take the kids. Robert apparently snapped. The most disturbing part was finding a floor plan in one of the articles that showed the bedroom where it happened was the master bedroom, the one my husband and I were sleeping in. I called the host immediately. When she answered, I tried to stay calm and just asked directly if she knew about what had happened in the house. There was this long pause, and then she said, "Oh, that was so long ago. I didn't think it mattered." I told her that of course it mattered, that we had children with us, that this was something that should have been disclosed. She got defensive and said it wasn't required by Airbnb to disclose deaths in a property, especially ones that happened decades ago. She said if we were uncomfortable, we could leave, but she wouldn't be refunding us because it wasn't her problem if we were superstitious. We decided to stay. We'd already paid for the week, and hotels in Savannah during spring break were either booked or outrageously expensive. But the whole vibe changed. I couldn't sleep in that bedroom anymore knowing what had happened there. We told the kids there had been a sad event in the house a long time ago, but didn't give them the full details. Emma found the articles online anyway. She's 11 and resourceful, and freaked out. That night, things started happening that I still can't explain. Doors would slam shut on their own when there was no breeze. We'd all be downstairs and hear footsteps upstairs. The most unsettling thing was this old music box in the parlor that none of us had touched. It started playing by itself at 2 in the morning. The tinny little melody woke all of us up. My husband went down to stop it, and he said the lid was open and the cylinder was turning, but when he tried the mechanism, it was stuck and wouldn't wind. The kids were terrified. Emma refused to sleep alone in the turret room and moved in with us. Carter had nightmares. We tried to rationalize everything. Old houses settle. Wind can catch doors. Maybe the music box had a loose spring. But deep down, we were all scared. There was this heavy feeling in the house, especially at night, like the air was thick with sadness. On our fourth night, we were all in the living room watching a movie when the deadbolt on the front door clicked locked from the inside. We all heard it. My husband tried the door, and it wouldn't open. The deadbolt was turned to the locked position, but we were all 10 feet away when it happened. He had to unlock it to get it open again. That was it for us. We packed our stuff that night and left first thing in the morning. We stopped at a cafe for breakfast before leaving Savannah, and I mentioned to the owner what house we'd been staying in. Her face fell, and she said, "Oh, honey, everyone local knows about that house. Nobody from here would ever stay there overnight." She said it had changed hands multiple times, that it was always being rented to tourists who didn't know the history, and that she'd heard stories from other visitors about strange experiences. Airbnb refused to refund us. They said unexplained events weren't grounds for a refund, and that historical tragedies didn't violate their hosting standards. We're out the money, the kids had their vacation ruined, and I'm still angry that this wasn't disclosed. People deserve to know what happened in a place before they bring their children there to sleep. My girlfriend Sarah and I needed to get away from everything. We'd both been working insane hours. I'm a software developer, and she's in nursing, and we were burned out and snapping at each other over stupid things. We decided we needed a long weekend completely off the grid. No phones, no laptops, just us and nature. I found this cabin listing in Olympic National Forest in Washington that looked perfect. It was described as secluded and rustic. Solar panels for minimal electricity. No Wi-Fi, no cell service for miles. The photos showed this cute A-frame surrounded by massive trees, and the host emphasized that the nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away. It was exactly what we wanted. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in late October. The last 20 minutes were on this narrow dirt road that wound deeper and deeper into the forest. When we finally reached the cabin, it was stunning, totally isolated, wrapped in towering Douglas firs and cedars with this mossy, primeval feeling. The air smelled like rain and pine. We unloaded our stuff, and I remember Sarah saying she could already feel her stress melting away. We had no idea what was about to happen. That first evening, we made dinner on the propane stove and sat on the deck watching the light fade through the trees. The forest got dark fast, like really dark in a way that city people don't experience often. We're from Seattle, so we're used to trees, but this was different. This was deep wilderness. Around 8 o'clock, just as it was getting fully dark, Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line about 50 yards from the cabin. There was a light. Not like an animal's eyes reflecting, but a small, steady light, like someone holding a flashlight or a lantern. I stared at it for a minute, trying to figure out what it could be. Then I saw the silhouette of a person standing there, just standing completely still, holding something up to their face. It took me a second to realize what it was. Binoculars. Someone was watching us with binoculars. My heart started pounding. I waved my arms and shouted, "Hey, hello." The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just kept standing there with the binoculars pointed at us. Sarah wanted to go inside immediately, and honestly, so did I. We went in and locked the door, which felt ridiculous because it was just a basic cabin door with a simple lock. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the host checking on the property. Maybe it was a hunter or a hiker. But why would they just stand there watching us? And who hikes at night? We tried to see out the windows, but with the lights on inside, we couldn't see anything in the darkness outside. We turned off all the lights and waited by the window. The figure and the light were gone. We barely slept that night. Every sound, and the forest makes a lot of sounds, had us on edge. But morning came. The sun was shining through the trees, and in daylight, the whole thing felt less threatening. We decided we were being paranoid. We'd paid for 3 nights and driven 3 hours to get there. We weren't going to let one weird moment ruin our trip. We spent the day hiking on the trails near the cabin. The forest was incredible, and we started to relax again. Around midday, we were about a mile from the cabin on a ridge trail when Sarah stopped walking. She was looking back the way we'd come, and she had this look on her face that made my stomach drop. She whispered, "That's the same person." I turned around, and way back on the trail, maybe a quarter mile behind us, was a figure. Same build, same dark clothing. They were just standing there, on the trail, not hiking, just standing and watching us. When we stopped, they stopped. When we started walking again, they started walking, always maintaining that same distance. We picked up our pace. Sarah was freaking out, and I was trying to stay calm, but I was terrified too. We kept looking back, and the person was always there, always the same distance away, never getting closer, but never falling behind either. When we got back to the cabin, we practically ran inside and locked the door. We watched from the windows, and about 10 minutes later, the figure emerged from the tree line. Same spot as the night before, just standing there. This time in daylight, I could see it was a man, maybe middle-aged, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. He stood there for at least 20 minutes just watching the cabin before he finally turned and disappeared back into the trees. We were done. We both wanted to leave, but it was already late afternoon, and we didn't want to drive that dark forest road at night, especially knowing someone was out there. We decided we'd leave first thing in the morning at sunrise. We pushed furniture against the door and took turns staying awake to keep watch. Around 2 in the morning, it was my turn to sleep, and Sarah was sitting in the chair by the window when she grabbed me and shook me awake. She couldn't speak, just pointed at the bedroom window. There was a face pressed against the glass, a man's face, inches from the window, just staring in at us. His breath was fogging the glass. We could see the condensation spreading with each exhale. Sarah screamed, and I jumped up, and we both just stood there, frozen in terror. The face stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably 30 seconds, just staring. Then it slowly pulled back and disappeared into the darkness. We didn't wait for sunrise. We threw everything into our bags in about 3 minutes, got in the car, and drove out of there. I was driving way too fast on that dirt road in the dark, but I didn't care. We drove straight through to Seattle without stopping. The next day, when we had cell service again, I called the local sheriff's office to report what happened. The deputy I spoke to took down the information, but when I told him the address of the cabin, he got quiet for a second. Then he said, "Yeah, we've had issues with that property before." He wouldn't elaborate on what that meant, just said they'd increase patrols in the area. I left a detailed review on Airbnb warning other guests, but the host flagged it and got it removed for violating content policies. We never got a refund. To this day, I have no idea who that person was or what they wanted, but I know we got out of there before finding out. I got assigned to a project in Chicago last November that was supposed to last about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months at most. My company has me travel for work pretty regularly, and I'd gotten tired of hotels, so I started booking monthly Airbnbs instead. They're usually cheaper. You get a kitchen, and it feels more like living somewhere than just passing through. I found this 2-bedroom apartment in the Loop that seemed perfect for a long-term stay. Modern building, good location near the office, and the price was reasonable for downtown Chicago. The listing showed both bedrooms in the photos, so I figured I'd have space to spread out and use one as an office. When I arrived and met the host to get the keys, he was a bit awkward, but seemed fine. His name was David, probably mid-40s, soft-spoken, kind of nervous energy. He showed me around the apartment quickly, pointed out how everything worked, and then mentioned casually that one of the bedrooms was locked, and I should just use the other one. I asked why, and he said it was private storage for his belongings. I was a bit annoyed because both rooms had been shown in the listing photos, but honestly, I only needed one bedroom anyway. I figured he kept personal stuff in there since he was renting out his place. It seemed weird, but not unreasonable. The apartment itself was nice enough, clean, functional, good Wi-Fi. I settled in and got into my work routine, but after about a week, I started noticing a smell. It was faint at first, kind of musty and organic, like rotting food or mildew. I checked the trash, cleaned out the fridge, looked under the sink for leaks. I couldn't find the source. The smell seemed to be coming from the hallway near the locked bedroom door. I texted David about it, and he said he'd look into it but then never followed up. By the second week, the smell was getting worse, and I started hearing sounds from behind that locked door. Not like someone was in there, but rustling sounds like papers or plastic bags moving around. Sometimes at night, I'd hear what sounded like something shifting or falling over. I texted David again, more insistently this time, saying something was wrong and he needed to come check it out. He replied saying it was probably just the building settling and that old buildings make noise. But this was a modern building, maybe 10 years old at most. The smell became unbearable by week 3. It was this sweet, rotten stench that permeated the whole apartment. I couldn't cook, couldn't eat there. I started going out for every meal just to get away from it. I demanded David come over immediately, or I was breaking the lease. He finally agreed to come by, but when he showed up, he barely acknowledged the smell. He sprayed some air freshener, said he didn't notice anything unusual, and left. I was furious, but also starting to feel like something was really wrong with this guy. On the morning of my 4th week there, I woke up and walked into the hallway, and the locked bedroom door was open. Just standing open like someone had unlocked it and walked away. I stood there for a minute, afraid to look inside but also desperately curious after a month of wondering what was in there. I slowly pushed the door open all the way, and what I saw made me physically gag. The room was packed floor to ceiling with stuff. Not just storage boxes, but complete chaos. Newspapers and magazines stacked in columns that nearly touched the ceiling. Garbage bags full of God knows what. Old electronics, piles of clothes, empty food containers, pizza boxes that were clearly months old and covered in mold. The smell was overpowering. I could see cockroaches scattering across the piles. There were rat droppings on the floor. This wasn't storage. This was severe hoarding, but the worst part was the wall that I could partially see behind one of the stacks. It was covered in photographs. I stepped carefully into the room, trying not to disturb anything or step on something that would collapse, and got closer to see. They were photos of people sleeping, just sleeping in the bed in the other room. My room. Dozens and dozens of photos, all different people, printed out and pinned to the wall. Some looked like they were taken from inside the room, but others looked like they were taken through the window, from outside, or maybe from the doorway. And it wasn't just photos. There were small items arranged on a shelf like a display. A watch, a hairbrush, a phone charger, a book, sunglasses, personal items that clearly belonged to different people. I immediately understood what I was looking at. These were belongings from previous guests, and he'd been taking photos of them while they slept. I felt my skin crawl thinking about how many nights I'd spent in that apartment. Had he been taking photos of me? Had he been in the apartment while I was asleep? I started frantically looking through the photos, and then I saw one that made my heart stop. It was recent, and the person in the bed was wearing a shirt I recognized because I'd just worn it 2 days ago. It was me. He had a photo of me sleeping. I didn't touch anything else. I walked out of that room, grabbed my laptop and my bag with my wallet and documents, and left everything else. I went straight to the police station. I showed them the messages, explained what I'd found, and 2 officers went to the apartment with me so I could get my belongings. David wasn't there, but when the police saw what was in that room, they took it very seriously. They took photos, filed a report, and told me they'd be following up with him. I found out later from the detective assigned to the case that David had a history of this. There had been complaints before, but nothing had resulted in charges. After my report and the evidence in that apartment, they were able to get a warrant for his other electronics. Apparently, he had hard drives full of footage and photos from inside the apartment. Airbnb removed all his listings. He had 4 other properties and banned him from the platform. The whole thing still haunts me. I think about all those nights I slept there, not knowing he might have been in the apartment, in my room, taking photos. I had to get therapy to deal with the violation of it all. And I can't help but think about all those other items on that shelf. All those other people who have no idea their belongings are in some disturbed person's hoard. I had a work conference in Barcelona last June, and I'd been excited about it for months. It was my first time in Spain, and I'd extended my trip by a few days to explore the city on my own. I'm usually pretty careful about bookings, but I was busy with work and booked kind of last minute. I found what looked like an amazing apartment in the Gothic Quarter. Beautiful photos, modern renovation, great price for the location. The host had a few reviews that seemed legitimate, and everything about the listing looked professional. I paid through Airbnb, got a confirmation, and the host sent me detailed check-in instructions with an address. I arrived at the Barcelona airport on a Thursday afternoon, took the train into the city, and made my way to the address the host had provided. I was dragging my suitcase through these narrow medieval streets, sweating in the June heat, excited to finally drop my bags and shower. But when I got to the building number, something was immediately wrong. The building in front of me was nothing like the photos. The listing showed a renovated building with a modern entrance. This was a run-down building with peeling paint and a door that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. I double-checked the address. It matched. I tried the door code the host had sent me, but it didn't work. I messaged the host through Airbnb. I'm at the address, but this doesn't look right and the code isn't working. He responded within a minute, which at the time I thought was reassuring. He said, "Sorry, system error. Wrong building. Go to Carrer de la Princesa 47. Code is 2580. He made it sound like a simple mistake, like the app had glitched or something. I was annoyed, but figured these things happen. I pulled up the new address on Google Maps. It was about 6 blocks away. I dragged my suitcase over the cobblestones to the new location. This building looked more promising, more like the photos, in a nicer part of the Gothic Quarter. But when I tried the code, it didn't work either. The building had a video intercom, so I started pressing buttons to see if anyone would let me in. An older woman answered in Catalan, and when I tried to explain in broken Spanish that I was looking for an Airbnb, she got angry and said something I didn't understand before hanging up. I messaged the host again, now starting to feel genuinely worried. "This code doesn't work either. What's going on?" He replied quickly again. "So sorry, the owner gave me wrong information. New address is Carrer del Rec 89, code 1634. This is correct one, I checked." At this point, I should have known something was wrong, but I was tired, it was hot, and I just wanted to get inside somewhere. I trusted that Airbnb had verified this person, and I'd already paid. I looked up the new address, and my stomach sank a little. It was in a different neighborhood entirely, closer to the Barceloneta area, and according to the map, it was at least a 20-minute walk. I was exhausted, but I didn't know what else to do. I started walking, pulling my suitcase, my shirt sticking to my back with sweat. The neighborhood gradually changed as I walked. Fewer tourists, narrower streets, less polished. When I got to Carrer del Rec and found number 89, my heart sank. It wasn't an apartment building at all. It was a closed-up storefront with metal shutters, clearly abandoned. There was graffiti on the walls and trash piled by the entrance. I messaged the host. "This is a closed store. There's no apartment here. What is happening?" This time, he took longer to respond, maybe 5 minutes. When he did, his message said, "Wait there. My colleague is coming with keys. 10 minutes. Something in my gut finally screamed that this was all wrong. I opened the Airbnb app and really looked at the listing for the first time with a critical eye. I clicked on the photos and did a reverse image search on my phone. The photos were stolen. They were from a real estate website for a completely different property. My hands started shaking. I looked around and realized where I was. The street was nearly empty. The sun was starting to get lower, and I was in an area I didn't know with all my luggage and my passport. I messaged the host. "These photos are fake. I'm reporting you to Airbnb and the police." He responded immediately this time. "No, please wait. I can explain. My colleague has your keys. Just wait in the alley behind building. He's almost there." That's when pure fear kicked in. He wanted me to go into an alley. I looked behind the building and saw a narrow passageway between buildings, dark and isolated. In that moment, I understood that this was never an apartment. This was a scam, and I was being directed to increasingly isolated locations. I didn't know if someone was planning to rob me, hurt me, or what, but every instinct told me to get out of there. I started walking quickly back toward the main avenue where there were people and shops. I kept looking over my shoulder. When I reached a busy street with restaurants and tourists, I finally felt safe enough to stop and figure out what to do. I tried to call Airbnb customer service, but I couldn't get through to a person, just automated messages. I pulled up Google and searched for the photos from the listing combined with Barcelona apartment, and I found the real listing on a different rental site. It was a legitimate apartment, but it wasn't available for short-term rentals. Someone had stolen the photos and created a fake listing. I ended up going to a hotel near Los Ramblas and paying way more than I'd budgeted because everything was booked for tourist season. That night, safely in my hotel room, I did more research and discovered this is an increasingly common scam. Criminals hack Airbnb accounts or create fake ones, steal photos from real listings, post fake properties, and then lead victims to increasingly isolated locations where they're either robbed or worse. Some people have been mugged, some have had their luggage stolen while waiting, and there have been reports of more violent incidents. I reported everything to Airbnb with screenshots and details. It took them 3 days to respond, and eventually they refunded my money and said the account had been removed for violating policies. But that didn't change the fact that I'd been wandering around Barcelona being directed to increasingly dangerous locations. I still think about what might have happened if I'd gone into that alley like he asked. I moved to Austin for a temporary work assignment last summer and needed a place to stay for about 2 weeks while I looked for a longer-term rental. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and I was relocating alone, so I was careful about what I booked. I specifically filtered for places with private entrances and no host interaction because I value my privacy, and I'd be working from home some days. I found this converted garage studio in South Austin that looked perfect. It was a standalone unit behind the main house, had its own entrance, kitchen, bathroom, everything. The listing specifically said private entrance, no interaction with host necessary, and perfect for remote workers who need quiet space. That's exactly what I needed. When I arrived and met the host, my first impression was that he was overly friendly. His name was Ronaldo, probably in his mid-40s, and he insisted on giving me a full tour, even though the space was maybe 300 square feet and pretty self-explanatory. He showed me how to work the shower, the AC, the mini fridge, where the extra toilet paper was stored. He kept lingering, asking personal questions about why I was in Austin, whether I was single, what kind of work I did. I tried to be polite but kept giving short answers, hoping he'd take the hint. Finally, after about 30 minutes, he left and I could settle in. The next day, I was working on my laptop at the small desk when I heard a key in the door. Before I could even get up, the door opened and Ronaldo walked right in. I was still in my pajamas and hadn't even brushed my teeth yet. He acted like it was completely normal and said he was just checking the AC unit because he wanted to make sure it was working properly. I told him it was fine and that I'd appreciate if he could text before coming over. He said sure, no problem, but he didn't apologize or seem to understand why I was uncomfortable. It happened again the next day. This time, I was dressed at least, but I was on a work video call. I heard the key, the door opened, and Ronaldo walked in talking at full volume about checking the water pressure. I had to mute myself and mouth at him that I was on a call. He mouthed sorry, but then just stood there in the kitchen area running the faucet while I tried to finish my meeting. When I hung up, I was pretty direct with him. I said that this was supposed to be a private unit, and he couldn't just let himself in whenever he wanted. He got a little defensive and said that he needed to maintain his property, and that these were all legitimate maintenance issues. By day 4, the pretense of maintenance had basically disappeared. I came home from grocery shopping and found Ronaldo sitting on my bed, just sitting there, scrolling through his phone. He said he'd been checking the outlets and decided to rest for a minute. I completely lost it at that point. I told him he had no right to be in there when I wasn't home, and definitely no right to be sitting on my bed. He stood up and got this look on his face that was half wounded and half annoyed. He said I was being really uptight, and that this was still his property, and he was allowed to enter his own property whenever he needed to. I started documenting everything. I took photos of him in the space with timestamps. I kept all our text messages. The visits kept happening. He'd let himself in while I was in the shower. He'd come by at 9 at night to check something. One time, I was sitting on the couch in shorts and a tank top because it was a hot Texas evening, and he came in and sat down next to me like we were going to hang out. He started making comments about how I looked relaxed, asking if I wanted company, saying it must be lonely being new in the city. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I told him I wanted to leave early and get a refund for the remaining days. That's when things got scary. He stood up and physically positioned himself between me and the door. He didn't touch me, but his body language was clear. He said I couldn't just break the contract and leave whenever I felt like it. He said he had my ID information from the Airbnb check-in. He knew where I worked, and if I tried to screw him over with a bad review or a chargeback, he'd make sure I regretted it. He said all of this in this calm, matter-of-fact voice that was somehow more frightening than if he'd been yelling. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, but trying not to show it. I told him I needed to think about it, and eventually he left. As soon as he was gone, I called my best friend back in Dallas and just broke down. She told me to get out immediately and stay with her if needed. But all my stuff was there, and I didn't want to leave when he might come back and go through my things. We came up with a plan. She drove to Austin that night, and the next morning, while Ronaldo was at work, I'd figured out his schedule by that point. She came over with her boyfriend, and we packed all my stuff into her car in about 15 minutes. I left the keys on the counter and texted Ronaldo from the road that I'd left, due to his repeated violations of my privacy and his threatening behavior. He immediately started blowing up my phone with calls and texts, alternating between apologizing and saying I'd misunderstood everything, and then threatening me again, saying I'd violated the cancellation policy and he was going to charge me penalties. I blocked his number and filed a detailed report with Airbnb, including all the photos, text message screenshots, and a timeline of events. Airbnb's safety team actually took it seriously, probably because I mentioned his threat and blocking the door. They refunded me completely and told me they were investigating the host. I also filed a police report in Austin, just to have documentation in case he tried to contact me or retaliate somehow. The officer I spoke with said this kind of thing happens more often than people think, especially with male hosts and female guests in private units. The whole experience made me feel violated and stupid for not leaving sooner. I kept second-guessing myself, wondering if I was overreacting, if maybe he really was just doing maintenance. But my friend pointed out that legitimate landlords don't sit on your bed, don't trap you by doors, and don't threaten you when you want to leave. The power dynamic was all wrong from the start, and he exploited the fact that I was alone in a new city. I'll never book a place with a host living on the same property again. The four of us had been planning this ski trip to Breckenridge for months. Me and my 3 best friends from college, Marcus, Jenna, and Tyler, all needed a break from our lives. We're all in our late 20s now, scattered across different cities with demanding jobs, and we barely get to see each other anymore. We found this beautiful ski chalet on Airbnb that was perfect for our group. 3 bedrooms, a big living room with a fireplace, and a hot tub on the deck. The photos showed this cozy mountain retreat with vaulted ceilings and huge windows looking out at the slopes. We booked it for a long weekend in January and were so excited to finally have some quality time together. We drove up from Denver on a Friday afternoon, stopping to get groceries and beer on the way. The chalet was even better than the photos. It was right off one of the main roads but felt secluded, surrounded by snow-covered pines. We got there around 4, and it was already getting dark and cold. The temperature was dropping fast, and the forecast said it would hit single digits that night. We unloaded all our stuff, claimed our rooms, and Marcus immediately cranked up the thermostat. We'd been out on the slopes all day at a different resort on the drive up, so we were exhausted and freezing. That evening, we made a huge pasta dinner, drank wine, and just caught up on each other's lives. It felt so good to be together again. Around 9, we moved to the living room and built a fire. The heat was blasting because it was so cold outside, and the chalet was warming up nicely. We played cards, told old stories, laughed until we cried. It was exactly what we all needed. I started getting a headache around 10:30. Not terrible, just this dull ache behind my eyes. I figured it was from the altitude. Breckenridge is at 9,600 feet, combined with the wine. I took some Advil and didn't think much of it. But then Jenna mentioned she had a headache too. Then Marcus said he did as well. Tyler was the only one who didn't, but he said he felt kind of off, like queasy. We all blamed the altitude and agreed we needed to drink more water and get some sleep. We went to bed around midnight. I was sharing a room with Jenna, and I remember lying there feeling weird. The headache hadn't gone away despite the Advil, and I felt vaguely nauseous and confused, like my thoughts were moving through mud. I fell asleep anyway because I was so tired. I woke up around 7 in the morning feeling absolutely horrible. The headache was worse. I was incredibly nauseous, and I felt weak and dizzy. I could hear someone in the bathroom throwing up. I got up and found Marcus in there, pale and sweating, hunched over the toilet. He looked terrible. Jenna came out of our room looking gray, holding her head. Tyler emerged from his room and immediately sat down on the floor in the hallway, saying he felt like he was going to pass out. We all just sat there in the living room, feeling like death, trying to figure out what was wrong. Had we gotten food poisoning from dinner? But we'd all eaten different things throughout the day. Was it altitude sickness? But this felt different, more severe, and we'd all been at altitude the day before without issues. Jenna is a nurse in an ER, and she was going through symptoms out loud, trying to diagnose us. Headaches, nausea, confusion, weakness, dizziness. All 4 of us had the same symptoms. Then she stopped mid-sentence, and her face changed. She said, "Oh my God, this is carbon monoxide poisoning." The way she said it, with complete certainty and fear in her voice, made my blood run cold. She immediately stood up, swaying a little, and said we needed to get outside right now. We stumbled to the front door, not even grabbing coats, and got out into the freezing morning air. The cold hit my face like a slap, but I'd never been more grateful for fresh air in my life. We stood there in the snow, in our pajamas and socks, all of us breathing deeply, trying to clear our heads. Jenna was already on her phone, calling 911. She told them we had carbon monoxide poisoning and gave them the address. Then she went back inside, holding her breath, and started looking for carbon monoxide detectors. She came back out less than a minute later and said there weren't any. Not in the bedrooms, not in the hallways, not near the furnace. Nothing. The fire department arrived within 15 minutes, and they came in with monitors. The lead firefighter came out looking serious and said the levels in the house were over 400 parts per million. He said that's critically dangerous, that we were lucky to wake up, and that if we'd stayed in there much longer, we could have died in our sleep. They found the source. The furnace had a cracked heat exchanger and was pumping carbon monoxide directly into the house. With how cold it was and how high we'd set the heat, It had been running constantly all night. They made us sit in the ambulance while they checked our oxygen levels. We were all experiencing carbon monoxide poisoning. They said we needed to go to the hospital for oxygen therapy, so we ended up spending the day in the Breckenridge Hospital getting hyperbaric oxygen treatment. The doctors said we'd probably have lingering symptoms for a few days, headaches, fatigue, confusion, but that we'd be okay because we got out when we did. The fire marshal red-tagged the property and said it couldn't be rented until major repairs were done. When we contacted the host, he acted surprised, but when Airbnb investigated, they found that there had been previous complaints about headaches and feeling sick at the property. He'd ignored them. There were supposed to be carbon monoxide detectors by law, and he'd either never installed them or had removed them. We were supposed to have 2 more days in Breckenridge, but none of us wanted to stay. We drove back to Denver that evening and just felt grateful to be alive. Jenna said if she hadn't been a nurse, if she hadn't recognized the symptoms, we might not have woken up. Carbon monoxide is odorless and colorless. You can't see it or smell it. You just slowly lose consciousness and die. The whole thing still terrifies me when I think about how close we came. We tell everyone now to check for carbon monoxide detectors immediately when they arrive at any rental, and if there aren't any, to leave. It's not worth the risk. I'm a college student at Tulane, and last April during Jazz Fest, I was desperate to find affordable accommodation. If you've never been to New Orleans during Jazz Fest, you need to understand that hotel prices absolutely skyrocket and everything books up months in advance. I'd planned to go with friends, but our arrangements fell through at the last minute, and I was scrambling to find something I could afford on a student budget. I found this listing for a private room in a house in the Marigny neighborhood, which is walking distance to the festival grounds. It was cheap compared to everything else, and the listing clearly said private room with photos showing a bedroom with a full bed, a dresser, and a small desk. The host was a woman named Patricia, who had pretty good reviews, and in her messages she seemed really sweet and welcoming. I took the bus down from Baton Rouge on Thursday afternoon, rolling my suitcase through the French Quarter and into the Marigny. The house was a typical New Orleans shotgun style, a bit run down, but charming with a big front porch. Patricia answered the door and immediately gave me a hug like we were old friends. She was probably in her 50s, really warm and talkative, asking about my drive and my plans for the festival. She showed me around the house. It was cluttered and lived in, with religious icons everywhere and cats roaming around. Then she walked me back to the bedroom, and that's when I got my first surprise. There was a woman lying on the bed scrolling through her phone. She looked up when we entered, probably in her late 20s, and didn't say anything. Patricia said cheerfully, "This is my daughter, Nicole. She lives here sometimes when she's between places. You two will be sharing the room. I hope that's okay." She said it so casually, like this was a completely normal arrangement that I should have expected. I was stunned. I told her that the listing said private room, and I'd paid for a private room, not a shared room. Patricia's smile didn't fade, but her voice got a little tighter. She said the room was private from the rest of the house, and that she'd mentioned in the listing that family sometimes visited. I pulled up the listing right there on my phone and showed her. Nowhere did it say anything about sharing a bed with another guest or family member. It showed one person in the room photos, and the description said, "Perfect for solo travelers." Nicole sat up on the bed and gave me this hostile look. She said, "It's just a bed. What's the big deal? Are you some kind of princess?" Patricia laughed like her daughter had made a joke, but I could tell the energy in the room had shifted. I said this wasn't what I'd booked, and that I wanted a refund so I could find other accommodation. Patricia's demeanor changed completely. The warm, welcoming host disappeared, and she got cold. She said that wasn't possible, that I'd agreed to her house rules when I booked, and that I was being very rude and inflexible. I tried to stay calm and explain that this was misrepresentation, and that Airbnb would side with me. Nicole stood up from the bed and got in my space, asking if I thought I was better than them, if I had a problem with her specifically. I backed toward the door and said I just wanted to get my suitcase and leave. That's when things got scary. Patricia moved to block the bedroom door, and Nicole grabbed my suitcase from where I'd left it just inside the room. She picked it up and walked out into the hallway with it, and Patricia followed, and then I heard a door close and a lock click. I followed them out and found that they'd taken my suitcase into another room and locked it inside. I could see the closed door and hear them moving around in there. I demanded they give me my luggage back immediately. Patricia came out and said that we needed to calm down and talk about this reasonably, and that my bag would be safe in there for now. She suggested we all have some tea and work this out. I said I didn't want tea, I wanted my belongings, and I wanted to leave. Nicole came out and stood next to her mother, and they both just stared at me. 2 against 1. I was a 20-year-old woman alone in a house with 2 people who were acting increasingly unhinged, and they had my suitcase with my laptop, my wallet, my medications, my clothes, everything. I felt trapped and genuinely frightened. I told them that if they didn't give me my luggage in the next 60 seconds, I was calling the police. Patricia laughed and said I was being dramatic and that the police wouldn't come for something like this. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I told the dispatcher that I was at an Airbnb. The hosts had locked my belongings in a room and wouldn't return them, and I felt unsafe. Patricia's face changed when she heard me giving the address to the police. She started saying loudly that this was all a misunderstanding, that I was a confused guest, that there was no problem. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me until 2 police officers arrived about 10 minutes later. When the police knocked, Patricia opened the door with this huge fake smile and tried to explain that it was just a miscommunication between host and guest. I showed the officers the listing on my phone, explained that I'd been told I'd have to share a bed with a stranger, which wasn't disclosed, and that when I asked for my luggage to leave, they locked it in a room. One of the officers asked Patricia to open the room and return my belongings. She got the key and unlocked it, and Nicole brought out my suitcase, slamming it down at my feet. The officers walked me outside with my luggage and asked if I had somewhere safe to go. I didn't, so I ended up at a hostel that had 1 bed left in a shared dorm room. It cost me another $100 I didn't have, and I'd already paid Patricia for 3 nights that I wouldn't be staying. I filed a complaint with Airbnb, and after about 2 weeks of back and forth and submitting the police report number, they finally refunded me. But I'd already had to put the hostel on my credit card and miss a day of the festival dealing with all of this. Patricia left me a review saying I was difficult, entitled, and disrespectful to her and her family. I left her an honest review detailing everything that happened, and Airbnb actually removed my review for violating their content policy, though I have no idea what policy I violated by telling the truth. I later found other reviews from guests who mentioned similar issues: unexpected family members in the space, belongings being held, aggressive behavior when questioned. The whole experience ruined Jazz Fest for me. I spent the weekend anxious and broke, sleeping in a hostel dorm with 7 strangers, wondering if Patricia or Nicole might somehow find me. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't called the police. Would they have kept my stuff? Would they have forced me to stay and pay? The power dynamic was so skewed, and they knew it. They were locals in their own house, and I was a broke college student far from home with nowhere else to go. Thanks for watching Untold Whispers. If these stories made you think twice about your next booking, you're not alone. Hit subscribe to hear more true horror stories that'll make you check every corner of your rental. Stay safe out there, and remember, always trust your instincts. Until next time, keep those whispers close.